Bible. And we're kind of just using this as an introduction, this verse today. Proverbs 24, we mentioned it last week several times, but verse number 3, Proverbs 24 and verse number 3. And the Bible there says, through wisdom is an house built. It's interesting to talk about a house or a home. And it says, through wisdom is a house builded, and by understanding it is established. And by knowledge shall the chambers, when I read that, I think often of bedrooms, if you will, where, the children sleep, or mom and dad and all, the chambers. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Okay, so it mentions wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And really, I'm trying to help us to gain a little wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in this. And this thing can really turn on us, and I've been seeking the Lord on how to do it, because we don't want to spend the rest of our life making an excuse for ourselves. We want to grow from this, okay? But family dynamics are very important. We have really been talking last week and this week, too, about the family you grew up in a lot. Next week, we'll focus more on the family we have created, if you will, now. But the family you grew up in, there's no perfect home. And don't get that mindset. You'll see someone, a preacher, someone, boy, they had the perfect home life. It's amazing how often when you find out the truth, you're like, wow, I would have never dreamed. I remember we used to have a couple came very wealthy. He owned his own business and so on and so on. And from the outside, you think, wow, they got it all together. They lived in a very, very nice house and all that, and real close to the mayor at that time. And boy, I started to counsel with him, whatnot, a little bit. And I was like, wow, I'd have never dreamed. And as a young man, it was a good lesson for me. So don't get that mindset. Every family has family dynamics. And by that, we're meaning patterns of relating or interacting between family members. Everybody has, some are good or some are bad, okay? Everyone has a unique pattern, but there's common patterns that form. And we're talking about really some of these are problem patterns. Last week we talked about what is often called in our day and time the golden child. We used Joseph. I believe Joseph was a golden child. We read Genesis 37:3. Now Israel, that's the dad, loved Joseph more than all his children. That's just basically it right there in a nutshell. That's the golden child. Golden child in the family is the one that is exalted, lavished with attention and praise. Nothing they ever do as a child is ever wrong. Praise for everything they do, often lifted above siblings and sometimes above the spouse, which is going to create major, major problems. Just briefly here, we want to talk about this one, and I'm not going to really use Bible verses at the end. I'll give you some people in the Bible I think may be this one. But it's often called in our day and time called the scapegoat. How many ever heard of the person in the family called the scapegoat? You ever heard of that? Oh, good. A lot of you are familiar with these things. Good. That's good. It's the person who is blamed for the wrongdoing and faults of the family, really. They are the family's punching bag. They get bullied. They get criticized a lot. The dominant parent in these situations are often just, they won't take responsibility for problems, so they need a scapegoat to kind of blame for everything. And so this person becomes that scapegoat in the family. Of course, they're the dominant person, so they lead the family. That's how this person becomes kind of the family punching bag. They are portrayed as a black sheep of the family. They are told there's such a burden to have to raise. Oh, you're the hardest child in the world to raise. We had to grow up with you, all those type of things is the mentality a little bit there. It's really interesting. There are often people that they'll stand up for what's right. And So if someone's being picked on, they can't just sit and take it. They'll stand up, and hence a lot of times that's how they become the target, because the dominant person really wants to do something that's not right. Then this child's going to be the one that says something about it, and so that's going to be the child that gets it, if you will. And so they're kind of known for that throughout life. They're the one in the family that will stand up for injustice. They're often strong-willed. That's part of it. They care about it. They got a lot of empathy. They care about other people. If you see someone that is very involved in a cause where someone's being treated wrong, good chance some of those were the scapegoats in the family. They're often like that. But because they care about people also. I'm not trying to downplay that. It's a good trait, but it's often part of them becoming the scapegoat of the family. I think Jephthah in the Bible was one of those for sure. Remember Jephthah? I think he was I wouldn't say this for sure, but it looks like he's the firstborn. But he was the son of a prostitute. So the rest of the family just went after him and chased him away from home and so on and so on. I tend to think this is interesting, and I wouldn't argue over this, but I tend to think in some ways Jonathan was. Jonathan's an interesting character, and you look at him. He could fall under several different categories, but his dad tried to kill him. He stuck up for David. His dad was going to have him killed another time when they ate the honey. And remember, all Israel had to stick up for Jonathan and so on and so on. So maybe Jonathan. Leah, Rachel and Leah, I would think Leah is one. Gideon, if you had time to read through Gideon, Judges 6, good chance that Gideon was one. We won't take time to go through those because we're going to run out of time doing all these. Let's go to one more. We're just trying to get a couple in here. We'll try to draw some conclusions about our past, because next week we want to deal on more our families right now. Here's another one that in what we would call dysfunctional families, another pattern. A lot of times there becomes a lost child, or some will call it the forgotten child or the invisible child. It's the one that becomes invisible. You forget they're even there. They sometimes, because the family has so much problems, whatever it may be, maybe it's the family's fault, maybe it's not their fault, a lot of problems, a lot of trauma, and so this child's kind of like, so much problems, I don't want to create any more problems, so they just get in invisible mode, and you forget they're there, and they actually get forgotten about. They stay out of the way of problems. They spend a lot of time alone. They avoid problems. They don't want to create any more problems in the family, so on and so on. Sometimes I've seen older siblings go through issues, and they're like, I don't want to create any more problems in this family, so on and so on. They often think, well, it's pretty much what I just said. They often think their family's had enough trouble, so they try to avoid any problems by making themselves small and very quiet. Because that lost child is just very invisible, never causing problems, or often cast in a light. Well, he's a good kid, that type of thing. This child avoids interaction with other family members and basically disappears. They often become loners and are very, very shy. They become known as a dreamer or a fantasizer because they're just off on their own. And they're keeping everything inside, and they have their dreams and their fantasies, if you will. And I'm not saying necessarily bad, but you understand what I'm saying. They tend to have issues with addictions. They can get into sinful fantasies. They have a hard time confronting problems and situations. They sometimes have a hard time forming intimate relationships because they're just not used to it. They're used to going off on their own and avoiding situations and things. I don't know, and I'm just putting some names out here. I would love it if you got into a Bible study over this and you studied out some of these on your own. I love that. But I tend to think David's one of these. I remember Samuel the preacher came, and they were going to anoint someone to be the king. And got the oldest of Abinadab, and no, he wasn't the one. That kind of went through them. Actually, if you read it, when we were going through the life of David, we read it real closely. It looks like they went through it twice. And for whatever reason, Jesse, the dad, never went and got David. Whether he forgot about David or just didn't want David there, or didn't believe in David. But David was invisible in the situation, if you will, until Samuel the preacher said, we're not going to eat. We're not eating any fried chicken till you go get David. Okay, that's in the Hebrew. You have to study it out there, you know. And here's an interesting one. I think Jesus was somewhat that. Remember Jesus in the temple when he was 12. And, of course, he never really caused the family problems. He never disobeyed, you know. And he was literally forgotten about. And they left, went back home. And we're a good ways off. Oh, man, you know, we never have any problems with Jesus. Never have to look after Jesus. He always takes care of himself. And where's Jesus at? They literally forgot about Jesus. I think Jesus was. By the way, all these family issues we talk about, Jesus has been through that. And when we were having our class over in the other building, we talked a lot about that. Jesus and his half-brothers, and he had half-sisters also. And I think there's a lot of issues there. We've talked about that. And Jesus understands he's been through those things. He was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And it's amazing. I don't have time to get into it, but I really think Jesus in many ways can fit into every one of these. The scapegoat from time to time, and the forgotten child, and even the golden child. It's amazing. And there's others. We won't get into them. But let me just give you a couple thoughts, okay? We got 5 minutes left. You say, man, this thing is almost like opened up a can of worms, you know, and then I've got issues from my past and all that. Yeah, just want to just briefly say a couple of things about it. God often uses those that got great wounds. It is amazing. He often does that. The New Testament gives a lot of truths and principles. The Old Testament often has people that illustrates them. That's why a lot of times, a lot of these characters I mentioned are these Old Testament characters. There's a passage. I'll read it for you. Maybe just write down the reference, but it's 2 Corinthians. You'll probably know it. 2 Corinthians 12:9. It's a real familiar passage. And I want you to just notice a phrase. And hey, we got time. You look at it real quick. 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. And verse number 9. I want you to see a phrase in that. We're going quick this morning because really we're going to have one more week on this subject unless Lord changes it. But God often uses those that are wounded or weak. They have problems in the past. This is interesting. He says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, this is Paul, God speaking back to Paul because Paul had a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what it was. Most think his eyes, but we don't know that. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. Here's the thing I want you to see. For my strength, that's God's strength, is made perfect in what? In weakness. It is amazing. I'm not a well-known preacher and all that, and I'm not after all that stuff. But as I get to know even preachers and people that have been my heroes, and as be growing up, I think, man, they had the perfect home. And as I get to know some, I'm like, wow, they got a lot of past too. They got a lot of luggage, baggage too. You know, his strength is made perfect in weakness. Okay, and sometimes God allows these things in our life because that's where his strength is made perfect, in weakness. Okay, so I want you to just remember that. Then number 2 about this saying, the wounded or the weak, the hurt, they often seek God with just a passion, with an incredible passion, because they're messed up. They know they need God, and they know they have to have God. I think David was a little bit here. I mentioned already, I think David was the forgotten, the lost child. It's interesting, maybe even the scapegoat. When he killed Goliath, remember right before that, and he was saying, who's going to go get that guy? And his oldest brother, Eli, I remember his oldest brother said, I know the naughtiness of your heart. it really doesn't mention anything else about his parents besides he actually took and hid them over in Moab when Saul was trying to kill him. But nothing really, and David really wasn't, he was a great man of God, but he wasn't a good family man. He had an affair. He wouldn't deal with his children issues like he should have. That's why one man ended up killing another one, you know. Absalom and all those things, and actually Absalom and his son led in a revolt against him. He just had some difficult, probably he didn't have the best family, so David, he had issues as far as a dad. And I say all that to say David was probably a little bit messed up, if you will. But the big thing about David had a heart for God. David is the one that God used to pen the psalm, about half of the Psalms. And I love Psalm 63. He says, "O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, says I've seen in the sanctuary." David is the one that God used to pen and say, hey, as the deer, they're just panting after water. That's the way I pant after you, God. I got to hurry along, but I can't miss this story. But I try to go out in the mornings. A lot of times there were deer over in the side yard, and our dog has a little collar, shot collar. He's going to go so far, and I took it off, and he seen those deer, and he knew that collar was off. Man, he took off after those deer. And the deer were like, man, you're not supposed to go this far. And they realized he's coming after us, Man, they were running everywhere, and he was fast as he could going after them. Anyway, those deer can run real fast, but only a short time, and then they get very out of breath. And David said, that's the way I am for you, God. That's why God chose David. He's a man after God's own heart. He had a passion to know God. And God often uses that. And then when the Lord uses those that have wounds and issues and problems, they're more apt. Now they got a flesh like us all, but we can be a little bit more apt to give God glory. Okay, 1 Corinthians. If you just write this reference down, 1 Corinthians 1, 27 through 29. That's where he says God often doesn't choose the mighty, the noble. He chooses the weak and the base and the foolish things to confound the wise, and so on and so on. And that last verse says, why? That no flesh shall glory in his presence. And so if you say, man, just discussing this stuff brings up a lot of wounds and like opening up a can of worms in my life, hey, God's got a reason for that. And he can bring a lot of good out of that. And those are often ones that God uses in great ways. And so God had a purpose for those things in your life. And next week we'll be on the new property, and then the next week we'll go back and we don't want to create these issues for our children and so on and so on. We'll work at that aspect of it. But we got to pray and be dismissed, and we'll get ready for church. Thank you for being in Sunday school, and I mean that. Thank you for being in here. Work at this.